Well, thanks to my colleagues today for their contributions to this work from the Forest Service and DNR, in particular Teddy and Alex. And we have a tag team presentation for you today. It's really the story of two related studies that we call Phase 1 and Phase 2. And Phase 1 is in the past, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the key results. And Phase 2 is in the future. It's been planned for a couple years. And my colleague from the Forest Service is going to talk a little bit about that. I wanted to start with this figure from Warren. And this is data from Basin 584. And 584 is one of the catchments where the experimental forest conducts long-term monitoring. And we'll say a little bit more about 584 in a while. But I wanted you to notice the slope of this line for air temperature on the x-axis versus water temperature on the y-axis. And as Warren had mentioned, if we look at more focused results from his analysis, we see that some of these catchments, like 584, are indeed thermally sensitive. And we've seen this sensitivity before. And it was related to surface area in very small catchments. And that brings us to the story of Phase 1. And Phase 1 was a before-after control impact study, which allowed us to pair reference and treatment catchments to model the temperature effect. It was implemented on DNR lands in Southwest Washington. The time period for data collection was about 02 through 07. And it was a collaboration between DNR and the Forest Service and ECY. And we did get a couple publications out of this work. One dealt with small headwater wetlands, and another one dealt with stream temperature. So we were working in these very small headwater catchments with base flow of just a few hundred milliliters per second. 8 clusters of small basins, 3 buffer treatments, distributed over 2 regions. The bicoastal meaning out near Menlo, and inland meaning in Capitol Forest. And DNR handled the timber sales and the treatment layout and so on, and also a description of the vegetation. And we were also mainly, though, focused for our work on stream temperature with some covariates, landscape variables like gradient, elevation, forest canopy, and so on. And then also biology. They're working on some amphibian studies, and mollusk studies, small mammals. This slide shows one of the typical study streams at base flow, so the time is late summer. These white things, here's the channel. So this is the downstream end of it. These white things are sandbags. We had installed these weirs in the channel so that we could monitor through these pipes. We could get readings on things like discharge and invertebrate drift. And our temperature monitoring stations are right about here, just above these weirs. And the weirs themselves are at the downstream end of these channels, and right at the boundary for the riparian management zone. So as we were working on these channels, we noticed that they were a mix of surface and subsurface flow. And we became concerned that this might have some influence on our interpretation of the temperature results and also the biological results. And so we worked up a way to survey stream hydrology, and that's what you're seeing here. This is one of the clusters of catchments, so there are 4 streams, 1, 2, 3, 4. And what DNR had done when it was laying out these streams or describing these streams is break them into segments based on a certain protocol that accounted for changes in gradient and confinement. And we were able to build on that by then surveying each of those segments, and we would rate it for % of surface flow. So this is what you're seeing here. This stream, the darkest blue means most continuous flow. The white means the channel is dry. So this one flows almost continuously, except for a little bit at the top. This one's totally dry. This one's kind of a mix, wetting and drying, and so on. And so this is kind of what the study system was like. When we do these surveys, we do them month after month, year after year, and we develop this picture of where the surface flow is in the channel. And we can use that later because then we know what the length of surface flow is above our temperature monitoring stations. And as we're doing all that, we start to notice these what look like small wetlands along these headwaters channels. And here is the channel. You can't see it very well, but this feature is actually abutting one of the study channels here. It looks like is the weir. And we turn to the literature and we see that very little is known about these little wetlands. And so, but we also see that they may have some influence on things like stream temperature and discharge and biology and so on. So we decide to survey them. And what we do is adapt the wetland triad surveyed method to these tiny wetlands. And here's an example of how that works. Essentially what we wind up with in the end is a shapefile that describes the georeferenced position and shape of these wetlands, and that's how we get their area. And so what we would do is, what's shown here in blue is two of the study channels. So here's one that's flowing almost continuously along its length, and here's another one. And we would walk up these channels, starting at the bottom, looking for evidence of wetlands, hydrology, vegetation, or soils. And if we saw evidence of that, we would test, we would apply the wetland triad, and if the wetland qualified, then we would survey it. So we'd measure it, we'd measure its axes, we'd draw a picture of it, and then we would take that back to the agency and work up these shapefiles and get our areas out of them. So what did we see? We saw that these features were common. There were about 70 of them. Their average area was about 80 square meters, and all of them were smaller than the 0.25 acre survey and manage criteria. We saw a relationship to hydrology. Most of the features were concentrated on channels of perennial flow, and we saw a relationship to aspect. Features were clustered on northerly aspects inland, but out near the coast it was all aspects. The idea was maybe inland sites are a little bit drier, so these features were more supported on north aspects. And we concluded that if our results were representative, on average about 19 hectares of wetlands, we would find about 19 hectares of wetlands in headwater catchments per 1,000 catchments. And so we kind of left this question in the paper, what dominates these catchments in terms of stream surface area? Is it streams or is it wetlands? And so then back to the full study. This wetland work was really just a sideline. And we go back to focus on temperature and biology, and we start looking at our temperature results, and we see that they're not quite as predicted. There are 3 treatments, clear cut on one end, and a continuous buffer on the other end, and in the middle, something we called the patch treatment, just for shorthand, which is really it's a discontinuous buffer, so partially buffered and partially not. And what we see is that the temperature effect for the buffered streams and the clear-cut streams looks about the same. And if anything, the patch cut is running a little bit colder. And then we notice something. We notice that it seems that in every treatment there are two types of streams. There appear to be streams that are thermally sensitive and streams that are thermally insensitive. So what we're seeing here is the year one data, the first year after logging for these streams. And the streams have been, these are the streams that appear to be insensitive. There are two of those in the continuous treatment and two in the thermally sensitive treatment with a wider range of variation, and these have a very narrow range of variation. And then the same in the patch treatment. Narrow range of variation, temperature not really changing. Here on the y-axis is the modeled temperature effect that I had talked about briefly. And then the same for the clear cut. And we see that this pattern persists throughout the study. So here on the y-axis is year after logging for these catchments, year 1, year 2, year 3, and so on. And then again on the y-axis, the modeled temperature effect. And this is the data that we just looked at right here in year 1, collapsed into two box plots. But still, we seem to see temperature, some streams, the temperature doesn't seem to change after logging, and some that do, year after year. And there are some other details, like here, this, between these 2 years was the windstorm in 2007. And one stream that was in this group experienced a debris flow, and which scoured the channel down to bedrock. And after that event, the temperature increased about 4 degrees. It moved from this group up there. So we turned to our landscape variables to try and explain this. And finally we get to the wetlands. And we see that if we go back and sum up all those little wetland areas per stream, like they were all random numbers of wetlands and size and so on, and if we sum those up per stream and plot it against the temperature effect that we observed, we get an R-squared of about 0.95. And we notice something else then, which is that these streams with few or no wetlands are on coarser substrates, and the ones that seem to have wetland development are on finer substrates. And we then turn to, we then run correlations for all our landscape variables, and you can see them here. But we also see the same sort of thing when we use surface flow, because we know the length of flowing surface water above our temperature monitoring station. So the correlation isn't quite as good. It's about 0.75 versus 0.95, but we seem to be seeing the same thing in both cases, which is surface area. And with that, on to phase 2.